What do you think of Merz as a leader? Does he have the capacity to galvanize Germany? Because it's not just Germany. It's obviously France is in a period of political paralysis and polarization. Poland seems to be one of the larger regional powers that is really picking up the mantle towards countering the Kremlin and supporting Ukraine. If Merz can come in, do you think that they can unify these countries again? Because the EU, the NATO alliance internally is looking a bit fragmented at the moment.
You know, it's embarrassing that Musk has stuck his nose into everybody else's politics, including UK as well. Friedrich Merz, I think, is going to be a very strong leader. He's a business guy, obviously, but also a longtime skilled politician. I think he has the capability to be very sober and direct, and he understands that Germany has to be a leader in Europe, but it doesn't require him to stand up and say, okay, we're the leader.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going? So, with a new year presents new opportunities, but also continued risks. And one of them is around Ukraine. In about a week's time, at the time of recording, Donald Trump will be inaugurated as the US president once again. And we've had some interesting developments over the new year period in that Trump has sort of alluded to the idea that his 48-hour ability to get the war sort of wrapped up, so to speak, is more like 6 months. There's also been a few appointments, which is reflective of perhaps a different direction. And you can find a couple of videos on the channel that I made with some other guests about sort of how things for Ukraine might look a little bit different to how we thought they might under a Trump administration. But someone who is much more up to speed with these sorts of details and hopefully can break them down for us is Ben Hodges, a gentleman who's been kind enough to appear on the show back in August of last year when we were sort of still digesting the Kursk offensive, or I believe we had a difference of definitions there, Ben. But Ben is the United States Army officer who was the commanding general for United States Army Europe and is also incredibly active in many areas of political and military discourse at the moment. Ben, it's lovely to have you back on. I hope you had a good new year.
Well, I'm grateful that you're giving me another chance, Peter. And yeah, it was a good holiday, but you're right about 2025. It is going to be a doozy.
That's one way of putting it. And I fluffed up the initial introduction of this because I was trying to think of what exactly to ask you first. But I think very simply, I want to get straight to it, which is that Trump's rhetoric has seemingly softened. I'm not going to say that suddenly he's going to support Ukraine all out, but he's giving more time by which he wants to sort of draw down support of the US, at least, to Ukraine. The appointment of General Kellogg seems to be interesting as the sort of go-between between the Kremlin and the White House. Can you break down exactly what you see in these changes, or is it not really anything to shout about?
Well, actually, I see a glimmer of hope that Trump will not do what he talked about doing back during the campaign. Now, look, it's not unusual that when people who are elected to high office are faced with actually having to carry out policy and live with consequences, it changes perspective a little bit more than when you were just on the campaign trail and trying to get elected. That's not unusual. And plus, the president-elect and his team will have been getting intelligence updates as we approach the actual inauguration 1 week from today. So I suspect that that's had a sobering effect, but it also, Mr. Trump is going to take office next week with enormous leverage over Vladimir Putin that he did not have 8 years ago or even 4 years ago. Trump comes in, he's going to inherit a U.S. economy that is in very good shape. He's got very, very strong domestic political standing. And most of the nations of NATO and the EU are looking to the United States for some leadership and for direction about Ukraine, or at least they want to know that the U.S. is not going to just back out. So I think they're getting a lot of that. The Russians, on the other hand, are in a much weaker position today than they were a year ago. I mean, not only have they lost hundreds of thousands of casualties, their economy is in terrible shape. The banks and everything are being propped up with a lot of artificial measures, and there's growing discontent inside Russia. Plus, the Russians were unable to save their staunch Syrian ally, Bashar al-Assad, um, because they're so overstretched themselves in Ukraine. All of these point to a possible scenario where maybe Trump sees he could actually help Ukraine defeat Russia, not because he loves Ukraine, but because he would be seen as the guy that got it done. And it also would send a powerful message of deterrence to China.
So, to play devil's advocate for the sake of argument, people who are less, shall we say, supportive of your perspective point to the fact that Russia, at least on the ground, in the tactical level, we're talking about strategic a bit, is the Russians are making gains. You know, they have the momentum, albeit I don't personally think gaining another hay bale and field is the overarching direction of a war, right? What do you say to that? Because, you know, the Ukrainians are struggling at that point, but you think none of that really matters if in the longer term Trump will still come to the support of them because of the state of the Russians.
But you're right. And actually, I would challenge the hypothetical that you or devil's advocate position you just laid out. I mean, I remember 11 months ago being in Munich at the Munich Security Conference when Avdiivka was finally captured by the Russians after months and months and months and many casualties. And people in Munich were walking around, oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen. Well, if you look on a map, Avdiivka is about as far east in Ukraine as you can go. And since then, they have, the Russians have been trying to capture Pokrovsk. It's about 65 kilometers from Avdiivka. They have not been able to do that. So I don't think Russia has momentum at all. I watched a video today of golf carts and pickup trucks loaded with Russian soldiers getting blown apart by Ukrainian drones. So I don't see any momentum on the Russian side. They clearly do not have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war or even to achieve a breakthrough and exploit it the way their grandfathers would have done back in the Second World War. So I think the amount of territory that has been taken by the Russians in this past year, 3,600 square kilometers, okay, that's 60 by 60 kilometers by 60. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's nothing. At the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. And that's without the West actually really committing to helping Ukraine win. In the meanwhile, since this counteroffensive back in August, when the Ukrainians went in the Kursk direction, so that's August. So that we're talking about now January, 6 months ago, and the Russians have not been able to eliminate that bridgehead. Yes, of course, they've reduced some of it. But this has created a dilemma for the Kremlin that they can no longer ignore. They there's resources that are being diverted to it. And if you think about negotiations, and Putin and Lavrov both said, you know, wherever we negotiate, what we have is ours. Wherever the lines are, that's where we are. Okay, well, you've got Ukraine occupying part of Kursk. So I think all things together, and finally, by the way, the Biden administration finally is starting to put sanctions on these Russian vessels that are used to export oil and gas to India and China. Finally, I would not want to be in the Russian position in 2025.
But again, Ben, I'm going to be provocative, right? I'm going to push back because, yes, I agree with all of that. And I think the emphasis we've always said, but people who are more pro-Kremlin seem to not be able to understand, or they deliberately sort of overlook, is that no one expected Ukraine from the beginning to be able to counteract the Kremlin and the military, the might of the second largest army. But that's the point. The Ukrainians have done that, and it's that ingenuity, that innovation. No one's saying that toe-to-toe, man-to-man, it's going to be exactly the same, but sort of that's a disingenuous framing of the argument. But at the same time, the Russians do have a military-industrial base, if you want to call it that the Ukrainians still don't have yet. I mean, in the production of, say, ballistic missiles, drones, other methods of offensive warfare. Do you not still think that could be a problem for Kiev in the coming months, unless they can sustain it?
Certainly, I don't want to make it sound like, things are all going perfectly for the Ukrainians. Of course, it's not. Russians are still killing innocent Ukrainian civilians almost every night, going after civilian targets in cities. But think about all the stuff you just said. Over 60% of Russia's ammunition comes from North Korea. The so-called Great Russian Industrial Base cannot even produce their own ammunition. They import ballistic missiles from North Korea, and they get their drones from Iran. So I'm not impressed. They are not able to produce enough equipment to keep up with their losses. So and by the way, you've got people that work at these factories are joining the army because the bonuses are so high now that people that are needed to work in factories are headed to the meat grinder. So I think it's not an ideal situation. Now, on the Ukrainian side, of course, you're right. They are not yet able to produce enough to be self-sustaining. But we know for a fact that their capacity is increasing, number one. Number two, Europe is finally starting to wake up to the requirement to produce ammunition and capabilities. I saw this morning that the French have delivered over 110, 112 of these Caesar artillery pieces. That's a significant amount of artillery, and assuming that the ammunition comes with it. So I think if Europe got serious, really serious, and if the United States said it's in our interest that Ukraine wins, the industrial competition would be lopsided in favor of Ukraine. However, we haven't done that yet. Europe has not done that yet, so it's still definitely a struggle.
Indeed. So I've got a couple of specific questions, particularly one on this asymmetrical element, the ability for the Ukrainians to develop in-house munitions, equipment, arsenal, etc. But obviously their sort of, shall we say, intelligence, if you want, the way that they took out General Igor Krylov, if I'm saying that surname correctly, about a month ago, was quite a impressive feat, through an explosion just outside of his apartment block or an apartment block. What was your takeaway from that? The Ukrainians have this quite covert sort of skill set that the Russians are continuing to underestimate? Because also I believe he was part of the nuclear defense force of Russia, which, given the re-emergence and threats of nuclear rhetoric from Putin, what's your assessment?
Well, first of all, that was a message to all Ukrainian officers that they are not untouchable and that they will be held accountable. Every officer who is anywhere in the chain of command responsible for launching missiles against civilian targets should be very worried that their address is known and that somehow, somewhere, some date, they're going to be held accountable. And of course, they're uniformed officers. They're not exempt from being attacked as legitimate targets. But the fact that Ukraine has the ability to find these guys is impressive. And I think it does come down a little bit to Russian arrogance. And they have not been terribly clever on protecting information. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have been much more effective at protecting information, no matter how frustrating it might be to some journalists. So I think we're going to see continuing efforts on the Ukrainian side to go after leadership, which is the same thing that they're doing with long-range precision strike. Like they just took out a big headquarters here in the last couple of days. This is how you counter the Russian advantage of mass. You do it with precision that can destroy headquarters and ammunition. If you can take those two things away, then it almost doesn't matter how many unlucky, untrained infantry you have.
But if they have that capacity, then why not utilize it in even more ways than they have done? It was a couple of years ago that they took out the daughter of Dugin, right? The sort of, modern day Rasputin for Putin, right? His sort of political philosopher-esque. And they took her out in a car bomb. So why haven't the Ukrainians been leveraging these sort of sabotage tactics more as a way to really, get the Kremlin, if not rattled on the battlefield, at least rattled towards Putin's ability to command full control?
Well, I don't think it's been established or that the Ukrainians have said that, yes, we're the ones that killed the daughter of Mr. Dugin. So I would not link these together. Secondly, to do something like what they did with the e-scooter bomb that you referenced a few weeks ago. I mean, you don't just catch a flight to Moscow and then with a bunch of explosives and go in there and blow something up or put it on somebody's car. So these are pretty elaborate operations. So you have to go after very specific targets, and not every target that needs to be killed is necessarily going to make the priority list. So I would think that the Ukrainian side, particularly with General Budanov and people like that, they've got a plan and a list, and it should fit into the overall. I mean, it's not like a parallel universe where they're just killing whoever they can find. It ought to fit together as part of a concept of how Ukraine defeats Russia. And so I imagine they are working on doing even more of what we're talking about. I imagine they also have a team that's working hard on figuring out how they're going to drop that big Kerch bridge. That's not a couple of missiles. This is going to require an enormous amount of explosive to actually drop a span of that bridge, which is heavily protected. So these things take time and planning to get all the stuff in place. And of course, the Russians are anticipating all of these things as well.
Okay. No, I mean, I think Russian intelligence has had periods when it's been effective at intercepting, but yeah, other times it's been a mess. You mentioned also, well, actually, before I ask you that, I do want to, everyone's like, there's a different background once you got a door. I am in Paraguay. This is a podcast on the road, a traveling circus, if you like. So that's why I've got a different background. But anyway, my question for you, Ben, is about Germany. Now, you are in Germany at the moment. You've got a function later today, which is why we're going to have to reconvene for another discussion with you. But I wanted to ask you about your feelings, your anticipation of the snap election. Schultz has obviously been quite controversial for some. I don't know where you stand on your assessment of him, but how do you feel about the upcoming election in Germany and the AfD?
Well, first of all, I think that Germany does a very good job of holding democratic elections. I mean, it's an amazing process to watch. Obviously, I'm an American citizen. I don't vote, but I do see how it unfolds. And you never hear people talk about, my vote didn't get counted or it somehow was stolen, or there's no question about the legitimacy of the election. And there's always a very good turnout as well. The sense around here is that the CDU, Christian Democrats, are in a very strong position, and it possibly, I would say probably, looks like a CDU and Green outcome. They'll have enough to form a government, two-party coalition led by Friedrich Merz as the Bundeskanzler. That's pretty good. Of course, I'd love it if there was a way to get Pistorius, who is from the SPD, to continue as the defense minister. That guy is very good. But nonetheless, that's what it feels like. AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, it gets high numbers, but no other party wants to be associated with them. And I don't have the sense yet that they have great growth potential. I certainly hope they don't. But we'll see. But I don't see them being a part of the next government.
No, I agree. And I don't know if you tuned in for the Musk interview with the head of the AfD a couple of days ago, but it turned into more of an interview to Musk and them talking about human consciousness and the ability to colonize Mars. So very much helpful for the German electorate. But a little bit more, I'm just curious, what do you think of Merz as a leader? Does he have the capacity to galvanize Germany? Because it's not just Germany, it's obviously France is in a period of political paralysis and polarization. Poland seems to be one of the larger regional powers that is really picking up the mantle towards, countering the Kremlin and supporting Ukraine. If Merz can come in, do you think that they can unify these countries again? Because the EU, the NATO alliance internally is looking a bit fragmented at the moment.
Yeah, First, I don't think Miss Vital did herself any favors with this interview with Musk. I mean, she did not come across very well or even well prepared. Uh, but that's that stands aside. You know, it's embarrassing that Musk has stuck his nose into everybody else's politics, including UK as well. Um, Friedrich Merz, Friedrich Merz, I think is going to be a very strong leader. He's a business guy, obviously, but also a longtime skilled politician. Uh, he will, I think, he has the capability to be very sober and direct, and he understands that Germany has to be a leader in Europe, but it doesn't require him to stand up and say, okay, we're the leader. Because, you know, as you probably know, most Germans are just, they shrink from that. They don't want to be seen, and they worry that all their neighbors dread the idea of German leadership in Europe. And I think that what we do need in Europe is for Germany to just to get on and lead by example. You don't have to say, okay, everybody follow us. Just lead by example. They have the economic potential as well as the geography to do that. And you named off a couple of countries that are also an important part of the power future of Europe. Poland, absolutely. The Poles are not confused about Russia. They have a very large defense ministry and military, and their industry is growing. Finland and Sweden both are growing in terms of importance and for security. And Italy has also, I think, Prime Minister Meloni, she has probably surprised a few people with the job that she is doing. So it almost feels like the center of gravity of power of Europe is moving towards the east and to the north. France ought to be a part of this, but they have their own domestic problems. And I have to say that the UK seems to be sort of on the sidelines, not sure where to go yet. So Germany has the potential to provide that sort of to be that anchor around which other nations could coalesce from a economic standpoint as well as a security standpoint.
So just a little bit more, though, on this, because I think that one of the biggest frustrations a lot of people from at least a military perspective is that Europe remains disunited. It remains quite almost complacent, lethargic in its desire to take control of its own strategic autonomy, its destiny, if you like. And under Trump, we really need to do that. Plenty of people on the channel here who come from all walks are, emphasizing Europe needs to step up. And I think whether or not you like Trump in many ways, one area I can appreciate and agree with him on is that Europe needs to foot the bill when it comes to its own defense and the free rider issue. Whether or not you think that's as big a deal, I appreciate, you can counteract. But, what would it take? What will it take? Can we see 25 basically as the year where Europe begins to really take a grip of its own?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. I mean, when I look at Kaja Kallas and Andreas Kubilius, the two people inside the European Commission who are responsible for foreign affairs, foreign policy, and for defense, and Dr. von der Leyen, they're serious people. And that I think are driving Europe towards recognizing that there is a threat. Usually, and this is true in the U.S. too, it usually takes a disaster to shake people up enough to actually do something. And I hope that Europe will get serious about defense before the disaster of Ukraine failure. Because if Ukraine does fail, it will be because the United States and Germany and UK and a couple of others failed, that we did not do enough to help them. And then you're going to end up with millions more Ukrainian refugees pouring into Poland and Germany and Romania and other parts of Europe, and a continued disruption of food shipments, which affects food prices across Europe, and disruption of energy, which affects gas prices across Europe. And the Chinese will see that the collective, we don't have the political will to defend what we say is so important: sovereignty, respect for international law, freedom of navigation, and so on. So I think I hear it enough. I feel it enough that people are waking up that they have to do something. but I have not seen any slackening in Europe of people, going on their ski vacations or headed to Mallorca or all the other things that people have taken for granted here in Europe for decades. You don't feel like people are thinking, oh shit, I better save my money this year because taxes are going to go up to pay for more deterrence. Um, I do think that you're going to see more countries continue to raise their defense spending. And President Trump has done what every other American president has done since Harry Truman, complain about allies not doing enough. And at some point, they're going to have to because, understandably, American taxpayers are like, hey, I'd like to go on a ski vacation too, but we're paying for everybody else's defense.
So my penultimate question is basically something that I've been asking a lot of people, and sort of it's a little bit more philosophical though, is that the long peace, this idea that the peace dividend ever since the Second World War and that relative great powers don't go to war with one another seems to be very much either gone completely or severely on a sort of, it's on life support. And with Trump's rhetoric around Greenland, I've made a video about that, guys, if you want to go and check it out. It's separate. I'm not going to humor that with you, Ben. I want serious topics, but the long peace is seemingly at an end, right? Where does this leave us?
Well, it's not at an end, but it's definitely under duress. And that does worry me that the incoming administration talks and thinks almost the way they do in the Kremlin or in Beijing. I mean, talking about, great power and, Greenland. It's almost as if they think Greenland is it should be ours because it's rich in minerals. I mean, J.D. Vance basically said that. Well, that's exactly what they say in the Kremlin. I hope that this very unhealthy, dangerous sort of language dies a quick death. The Congress has a role to play here. And at some point, the allies, the combined economies of Europe can match the United States if they can get their act together. And I think also, as always happens, whenever one party gets everything, the House, the Senate, the White House, all of that, there's always overreach. And Donald Trump will be a lame duck president when the sun goes down on January the 20th. That's it. And we have these midterm elections in just 2 years, and the election cycle will be starting very soon for those. And so that means every member of the House of Representatives, plus 1/3 of senators, will be up for reelection. So Trump's got a very brief amount of time in which he can get things done before that's gone. So I'm reluctant to predict things, but I think what he is saying and what actually ends up happening will not necessarily be the same thing.
All right. And very simply then, you said he's got a short period of time. Well, we're entering that after a week from today. He'll be, doing all sorts of things domestically, foreign, whatever it is. What would you encourage viewers to most look out for concerning Ukraine in, say, the first couple of weeks, month?
Yeah. And I look forward to us resuming this conversation here in a week or two after the inauguration. I'll be happy to do that, Peter. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. You can hear I'm losing my voice already. I think he's going to have to focus on domestic things more than anything. To get legislation through the Congress in a short amount of time, it's very, very hard. The advantage he has in the House is like 2 people. So they're going to really focus on getting things, legislation that they want, primarily domestic stuff. I think they probably got 100 executive orders already stacked up, ready to go into effect as soon as he's in office, directing a bunch of different things. But I would pay close attention to what he really gets done with Ukraine. As you said at the beginning, this 24 hours, that's not going to happen. General Kellogg already said, 100 days or more before that gets done. And the Ukrainians have something to say about it. I think the Russians are not interested in doing it as long as they think that the West will quit. So I think we'll find out what kind of priority that really is for the administration.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Ben Hodges, who persevere despite his voice slightly disappearing. Also, he thinks it sounds perfectly fine to me. Thank you very much, General. It's been an absolute pleasure. And everyone, look forward to part 2, reconvening sometime a bit in the next couple of weeks. But everyone, as we say on the Global Gambit, you either got to get playing or you played. Take care.